We were interested for many years, as other patients, in what causes the myeloproliferative neoplasms. And in order to do this, you get into epidemiology, or trying to look at, we call it the causes, but as I put in the talk, it's actually associations that can be found by looking into the background of people and doing it as a comparison to other groups. So you can do this either by looking at comparisons in groups where data has been already collected. These are so-called cohort studies, and I discussed what had been found from those studies previously, but they're all very small studies. So we then wanted to look to see, could we do an epidemiological study in patients with myeloproliferative neoplasms? And we needed to look at all the different ways of collecting the data, finding out, developing questionnaires so that we get good data. And that was the MOSAIC study. We call it the MOSAIC study, but really we should call it the Mosaic pilot study. And in that we had a group of approximately 100 patients with different ways of recruiting the controls to see what worked, and then lots of information on actually carrying out the questionnaires, collecting biological specimens, which we will have for the future to analyse on both the patients and the controls, and quality of life. And what that study showed is that simple things like friend-family controls are easy to get. Other methods of collecting controls are probably no use, so you shouldn't pursue that. We had the questionnaires for the telephone interviews all worked up. We got good biological specimen collection, and we had very interesting results with the quality of life, where they showed that the quality of life, i.e. the symptoms experienced by MPN patients, were much more than the controls. We also actually collected enough information to be able to analyse to see were there any factors which were actually came out as being associated with MPN. Now, the study wasn't powered to do that, but sometimes when you do a study, if you get enough information and analyse it, you find that there are certain things there, and that were certain things like smoking, obesity in certain cases, numbers of previous CT scans which may or may not be significant, and also in some groups the number of people in the bedroom in childhood. The more people in the bedroom in childhood is associated with the development of an MPN disorder, but that may be a reflection of other things. In particular, it may be an economic reflection. If there are 3 children per bedroom, that it probably it reflects a lower socioeconomic status. So that was a lot of information from the pilot study. We then went on to try to obtain funding to do a much bigger study, because knowing how to do it and what was the best way to do it, then the issue is, can you now do 500, 1,000 people study? And MPN Voice are funding that. And we have everything set up. We have our staff employed, it's through ethics, and we would hope to open first sites hopefully before the end of this year. And that will be run in 10-12 sites across the UK. We would hope, there are plans that in other places like the Republic of Ireland and Australia, they're trying to get their own funding so that they can then run the study and get even bigger numbers of patients in. And hopefully if we get going within the next 2 years, we will have the full data collection study completed, and then obviously it's a question of analysing the data and seeing what we find. Our pilot study was the biggest study ever done in MPN. Although there were all this published literature, there are all sort of groups of 20 and 30 people. If we can do 1,000 patient study in multiple centres, then what we would hope to see, again, it's what associations comes out, what is seen to be associated with the development of a myeloproliferative disorder. And that then gives you information to take further. And some of it I think we will see is things like the smoking and the obesity perhaps may come out. But there may be other things that we don't know about, and that's really why we're doing the study. I suppose one of the things that will interest you that we may see one of the things in the pilot study we saw was the development of a myeloproliferative disorder was associated with pig ownership. Now that actually implies all sorts of what chemicals or what goes on with the pigs. The trouble is that you can't, there's a difficulty with that because the numbers were small, and half the pilot study was done in Northern Ireland, where you would expect a relatively rural population, what that would mean. If you see that in the larger study, so if you go to 1,000 people study and you see, for instance, pig ownership coming out, that tells you all sorts of things. Then you can look into what chemicals, what goes on, is there anything there that can be taken further. The other things we would hope to see out of the study, we will have a huge collection of biological specimens, both from patients and controls. And that will be, we haven't got the funding at the moment to take that further, but once we've got those, I'm perfectly sure we will be able to apply for funding to do further work on the biological specimens. And there is actually a thing called molecular epidemiology, where you actually look and see on large numbers of specimens what molecular changes you find. The quality of life, which did come out of the pilot, highly significant. Again, we'll do that on a much larger cohort, so I would expect to really end up with a large body of data to support the symptom problems in the patients compared to controls. So I mentioned at the end of my talk, because I think it's interesting to this audience, another study called MPN Paces, and this is a study which has been funded by in Northern Ireland. It's called enabling grants because the idea is that they enable you to do a small study, which if it's significant will then put you in a position to get funding to do a much larger study, but you have to do a sort of proof of principle study first. And what we were interested in this is basically physical therapy in patients working with MPNs, and we've linked up with people who are in the University of Ulster University who are actually experts in this area. And what we're going to do is take 60 patients. One group will just be given a pedometer and told to carry on as always, and they will have their quality of life measured at the beginning, at the end of 6 months. But the other two groups will have various degrees of intervention. One given a bit more instruction about what they ought to do. And we're not talking about making people go out and run marathons or anything like that. We're talking about exercise regularly within what they can do. So one group will get a bit more instruction and then see what they do over the 6 months. And the third 20 people will actually get sort of a phone call from the nurse with motivational on a very regular basis. And the idea is to see is whether any of these interventions make a difference in what people do, and then we'll measure at the beginning and end and see what difference it makes to their quality of life. And they'll get to keep the pedometer. There are various groups of patients who come to this. There are people who have been very recently diagnosed, and we do our best to give them information, but doctors are at fault in all sorts of ways. They use jargon, you're living in a world of that, so explaining it all. We're also very time limited, so there's lots more that we could do for newly diagnosed patients, and many people find that a great advantage. But I think there's also many other patients come, those who've had their disease for a long time, and they're always interested in what's going on and what's new, and they find this very helpful. There's also the interactions between the patients, which in themselves, I mean, there's the buddy system in MPN Voice, but there are the interactions in general. Lots of things happen at these meetings that people get to do. I think one very simple thing is that these are rare diseases, and people appreciate talking and finding other people with the same problems and things that they have, because very often they feel like they're in total isolation.